The cultures and the people in and around the Machu Picchu area are unique, but they're also at risk for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of culture change taking place in these areas. One form of change that took place in the last 20 or 30 years is that roads were built that gave companies access to these areas deep in the highlands where they could do resource extraction or mining. And so there's been an incursion of industry into these areas. And in some cases, this mining can result in pollution. But it has impacted them in other ways too. It's made it easier for them to get back and forth between cities. And you can see that as a positive thing. Some of their kids are able to go to school while they weren't. But it also has had some unintended negative results as well. There's a lot of alcoholism in the Andes. A lot of people drink, and just like in Native American communities here in the US, Andean indigenous communities suffer from high rates of alcoholism. And roads actually made it easier for them to bring alcohol into villages. If you had to take 3 buses and then hike 3 hours vertical up a hill at 15 or 16,000 feet, it was very difficult to get alcohol to the village. But now that there are roads and buses and different forms of transport, you can take it up and it's a lot easier. The alcohol had a really negative impact on a lot of the communities because it resulted, or it was the precursor to, a lot of domestic abuse that took place. A lot of the men would drink, and a lot of women report being hit and treated in physical ways that obviously had a negative impact on the family. You have to remember that these communities are incredibly poor. They encounter a lot of hardship, both material and physical, and I think that alcohol has served in some cases as a way for people in the Andes to relax or to deal with some of their hardship. But in any case, it did result in domestic abuse, and it resulted in a lot of negative impacts, people not keeping jobs, people not being reliable, that kind of thing. So when you talk to a lot of Andean communities, you hear reports of this. The cultures are very incredible, though. I showed you this picture in the first week in our intro, but this is an old hat maker, and he has made hats like this for more than half of his life, and he's in his 80s now, and he's continued this tradition. This is actually a log that he has. He has these very old logs where he's written down the name and address of every person who's ever bought a hat. And if you look very carefully at this log, you'll see that he's sold 600 plus hats during the duration of his life. He has many of these logs that are piled up in a closet somewhere. And they're all made by hand. And he's just one example of how Andean traditions have been very resilient over the years. Chinchero is a community of potato farmers, and it happens to be at about 12,000 feet, maybe a little bit less than that, but it's very high in altitude. And it is the last, or one of the last towns that you would see descending into the Urubamba Valley before you go to Machu Picchu. Chinchero is a place like other areas in the Andes where religion has changed local life as well. The incursion of evangelical and Protestant faith into Andean communities has changed them in many ways. This is a woman in Patabamba, which is also a nearby community in the Sacred Valley, and it's a household that has converted in the last decade to the evangelic faith. The Andean worldview is a very different and interesting, unique perspective. In Andean cosmology, people believe in mountains. They consider them to be gods. They're called apus. They respect the rivers and the mountains and nature as a whole. But in the last 40 or 50 years, there's been a lot of missionaries that have come through these areas and attempted to convert people. And you can see, for example, this home in Patacancha with paintings that are related to the evangelical faith. Now, sometimes evangelicals bring gifts, and for example, they build an outhouse or a bathroom, or they bring some building materials, and they've curried favor with some of the communities in that way. Another thing, however, is that it's against the evangelical faith to drink, and so sometimes women have told me in many of these communities that they appreciate the evangelical faith and that they pushed their family and their husbands to convert to the evangelical faith in order to stop the drinking and stop what they perceived as the thing that was causing domestic abuse. So it's a complicated relationship, and we'll see how it goes from here. So between roads and mining and other forms of resource extraction and religion and alcohol, we're seeing a lot of change. And the last thing that I want to mention to you is that in Chinchero, there is a push upon the side of the Peruvian government to build an international airport. When you fly to Peru to go to Machu Picchu, you have to first fly through Lima and then jump on a smaller plane to get to Cusco. And so you have to take 2 flights. And the Peruvian government would like to eliminate that second flight. They would like to send very big jetliners right into the middle of this community here, Chinchero. This again is a very traditional community with a market and potato farmers and people who are weavers. And there are people within this community that speak only Quechua and not even Spanish. And to put an international airport right in this portion of land that you see in this picture on the other side of the community in that valley would have a severe impact on the community. The government has gone to the community members that lived right on that land that looks empty there, and they paid them millions of dollars to acquire the land. And they were tempted enough to do it, and they sold off that land, whereas a lot of other people in the community got nothing from the project or got nothing from that expenditure, but they're going to have to deal with this international airport that comes in. It's very difficult to imagine that there would be an international airport and Marriotts and hotels and shuttles in and around this area, but it's very possible that in 10 years, if you visit Machu Picchu, this is the way you're going to go. The government believes that having to take 2 flights, first to Lima and then to Cusco, reduces the number of tourists that go to Machu Picchu. Truth be told, there are already too many tourists in Machu Picchu. In fact, UNESCO, the United Nations, has told the Peruvian government that they want less visitors into Machu Picchu as it stands. But it's a huge industry, and there will likely be an airport built here. And once that airport arrives and the Western restaurants and the Western hotels arrive, this valley will be changed probably forever. And so we're going to see what happens with that over the next 20 years. This concludes our lecture today. You should be aware of the different forms of change that have come to the Andes in the last 20 to 30 years, and we'll convene over in Beachboard to continue our discussion.